The late Roman Republic was a restless beast. Its heart beat in the Senate, but its lifeblood ran through the endless campaigns fought at the edges of the known world. Rome had expanded beyond anything the early founders could have imagined. From the windswept moors of Hispania to the searing sands of Africa, from the dense forests of Germania to the jagged mountains of Anatolia. The cost of such an empire was constant vigilance, and vigilance required soldiers, thousands upon thousands of them. It was in this world of ceaseless mobilization that Quintus Salvius Salvidienus Rufus took his first steps into history. Little is known of his earliest years, and perhaps that is fitting. He did not emerge from the storied bloodlines of Rome's ancient patrician houses. He was no scion of a senatorial dynasty, nor the son of a celebrated general whose name carried weight in the forum. His origins were unremarkable, his family obscure, a background that in another life might have destined him for anonymity. But in the turbulence of the late Republic, even the obscure could find themselves swept into the current of great events. For young men with skill, endurance, and a hunger for advancement, the legions were the surest path out of obscurity. Rome at the time was a city swollen with the spoils of conquest. Marble temples rose beside ancient shrines of weathered stone. Markets overflowed with goods from all corners of the empire. Silks from the east, amber from the north, spices carried over deserts and seas. Yet behind the glittering veneer lay an undercurrent of tension. Political factions battled not only in the Senate, but also in the streets. Gangs loyal to rival politicians clashed in the alleys. Elections were decided as much by intimidation as by law. The assassination of political enemies was hardly rare, and even those who held the highest offices knew their fortunes could reverse in an instant. In such a city, loyalty was currency, and survival often depended on the ability to shift allegiance at the right moment. The legions, however, offered a different sort of stability. Service in the army was grueling, dangerous, and often thankless, but it gave structure to life. Discipline was absolute. Orders were obeyed without question. For men of low birth, it was also one of the few ways to accumulate wealth and honor. Victorious generals rewarded their soldiers with land, coin, and perhaps most importantly, a share in their personal glory. The bond between commander and legionary could be as strong as blood. It was here, among these soldiers hardened by long marches and brutal winters, that Salvidienus began to forge his path. His aptitude was evident from the start. Where others might falter under the weight of armor during forced marches, he endured without complaint. When recruits stumbled in formation drills, he adjusted his pace to maintain cohesion. He learned the rhythms of the camp, the constant maintenance of weapons, the precise construction of marching forts, the careful rationing of supplies, and as the months turned to years, he mastered the art of command at the small scale, the trust of a contubernium, the respect of a century. These were the building blocks upon which greater authority could be founded. The Rome of Salvidienus's youth was already edging toward civil war. The death of Julius Caesar's political rivals, the rise of Pompey, and the eventual confrontation between the two had left deep scars in the political order. Power was no longer decided solely in the Senate chamber. It was won and lost on the battlefield. In this shifting world, the distinction between military and political careers blurred. A capable officer could become a political force, and a political leader without military backing was vulnerable to sudden ruin. It was this reality that began to shape Salvidienus's ambitions. He saw the examples around him, men of humble beginnings who had risen to the consulship through battlefield distinction, and he recognized the potential for his own ascent. His first significant campaigns were likely fought in service to Octavian, the young heir of Julius Caesar, though the exact details are lost in the haze of time. What is clear is that by aligning himself early with Octavian, Salvidienus tied his fortunes to a man whose political destiny was still uncertain. Octavian was no natural-born warlord. His youth and inexperience made him an object of skepticism among many veterans. But he possessed one quality that would prove decisive: the ability to recognize and cultivate talent. Salvidienus became part of that early circle. Men who would fight not only for Rome, but for Octavian's personal claim to power. Campaign life in the late Republic was an education in both warfare and politics. A commander's orders were carried out not just through force but through persuasion, through the subtle balancing of promises and discipline. Salvidienus excelled in this environment. His leadership style blended strict enforcement of military law with an understanding of his soldiers' needs. He knew when to drive them hard, and when to allow rest, when to push an assault, and when to fortify and wait. Such instincts, honed over years in the field, earned him both respect and loyalty, qualities Octavian could not ignore. It was not long before Salvidienus's responsibilities expanded beyond the battlefield. Military command in Rome was inseparable from the governance of territory, and capable generals were often entrusted with the administration of provinces. These roles demanded more than martial skill. They required diplomacy, logistical acumen, and the ability to navigate the treacherous currents of local politics. Even at this early stage, Salvidienus demonstrated a grasp of these complexities. His reports were thorough, his supply lines reliable, his troops disciplined even in extended garrison duties. He seemed to understand that every administrative success was also a political investment, proof to Octavian and the Senate that he was a man who could be trusted with greater responsibilities. Yet the path to prominence in Rome was never straightforward. The alliances that propelled a man upward could dissolve overnight. Victories could breed envy as easily as admiration. A commander who became too popular with his troops risked being perceived as a rival by his patron. Salvidienus, navigating these hazards, learned the art of measured ambition. He advanced steadily, avoiding unnecessary risks to his position, while seizing opportunities that would solidify his reputation. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant awareness of the shifting political landscape. By the time Salvidienus's name began to be spoken in the halls of Rome's power, the Republic was already deep into the cycle of civil conflict. The assassination of Julius Caesar had splintered the political order into competing factions, each seeking dominance. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, a political alliance forged in the crucible of war. But even as they presented a united front, the seeds of rivalry were already sown. In this atmosphere, every military appointment carried strategic weight. To entrust someone with a province or a legion was to grant them influence in the grand game of survival. Salvidienus's appointment as governor of Gaul marked a turning point in his career. It was a position of immense strategic importance. Gaul was not only a source of wealth and manpower, but also a buffer against threats from the north. Administering it required both firmness and adaptability. Tribal unrest was a constant risk, and maintaining Rome's dominance demanded vigilance. For Salvidienus, the post was an opportunity to prove his worth on a stage far larger than the battlefield. His governance, by all accounts, was marked by stability and order, qualities Rome prized in its frontier provinces. It was during these years in Gaul that Salvidienus's political stature reached its peak. Octavian's trust in him was such that he was named consul for 39 BC, a distinction that placed him among the highest ranks of Roman leadership. For a man of his origins, it was an extraordinary rise. In the eyes of many, he was living proof of Rome's meritocratic ideals, the notion that ability, not birth, was the ultimate path to power. But behind the honors and titles lay the same precarious foundation upon which all Roman power rested: the favor of those above and the loyalty of those below. Salvidienus, like all men who climbed high in the Republic, knew that such favor could shift. A single miscalculation could transform a trusted ally into a threat in the eyes of a patron. And while his position seemed secure, the political landscape was already beginning to change. The triumvirate was fracturing. Octavian and Antony, once allies against mutual enemies, were moving inexorably toward open conflict. Salvidienus, stationed far from the heart of Rome's political theater, could sense the tension even at a distance. Messages from the capital carried not only orders, but also the unspoken weight of shifting loyalties. In these early years of his ascent, the defining qualities of Salvidienus's character took shape. Ambition tempered by discipline, loyalty intertwined with self-interest, a clear-eyed understanding of the machinery of Roman power. He had risen from obscurity to stand at the side of one of the most powerful men in the Republic. But the higher he climbed, the narrower the path became. Every decision carried greater risk, every alliance demanded careful maintenance. The Rome he served was a city where trust was provisional, and survival often depended on the willingness to act before one's enemies could. And somewhere within him, perhaps unnoticed even by himself, the seeds of his eventual downfall were already sown. The year 44 BC tore the heart out of the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar's body, still cooling on the marble floor of the Theater of Pompey, became the symbol of a world that had shifted in a single heartbeat. His death was not an end, but a beginning. The opening act of a storm that would batter Rome for more than a decade. The air in the capital was thick with fear and uncertainty, the streets restless with rumor. The Senate was paralyzed, and the people, always quick to turn from celebration to violence, hovered between outrage and panic. For men like Quintus Salvidianus Rufus, the assassination was both a warning and an opportunity. He had tied his fortunes to Octavian, the young, pale-faced heir named in Caesar Eris' will, at a time when few believed the boy could survive the political vultures circling above him. Octavian was not yet the hardened strategist history would remember. He was untested, fragile in appearance, and burdened with a legacy many would kill to erase. Yet he had one advantage no assassin's dagger could take away: the name of Caesar, and the loyalty of those who had served the dictator faithfully. Salvidianus saw in Octavian's rise not merely a cause to follow, but a vessel through which his own ambitions could sail. The streets of Rome made it clear that no one could survive without aligning with a power capable of defending itself. Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's killers, had fled east, their rhetoric about restoring the Republic sounding hollow against the reality of armed legions massing to claim Rome's destiny. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, had seized control of much of the state apparatus. Lepidus, another of Caesar's allies, commanded his own armies. And into this dangerous triangle stepped Octavian, armed with little more than inherited wealth, the loyalty of a few veteran officers, and an unshakable will to claim what he believed was his. It was in this crucible of uncertainty that Salvidianus began to distinguish himself. He had already proven himself capable in the organization of troops and the administration of territory. But now, the challenge was greater. Civil war demanded more than skill. It demanded an ability to adapt to chaos, to anticipate not just the enemy's moves, but the shifting tides of politics. The first months after Caesar's death were a blur of alliances made and broken, declarations of loyalty that dissolved overnight, and skirmishes that could decide the fate of entire provinces. Salvidianus's role in these early confrontations was not one of loud heroics, but of quiet precision. While Octavian negotiated with Antony and Lepidus, Salvidianus ensured that supply lines remained unbroken, that the troops remained disciplined, and that the territories under Octavian's influence did not fracture under the strain. In civil war, disorder was as deadly as the enemy. A single legion left unpaid could mutiny. A single province left undefended could defect to a rival. Salvidianus understood this intimately and worked tirelessly to prevent the cracks from forming. The political landscape, however, was too unstable to remain in stasis. Antony, seeking to consolidate his control, clashed openly with Octavian. The Senate, hoping to use Octavian as a counterbalance to Antony's power, granted him an official command against Antony's forces. It was an extraordinary gamble, arming a 19-year-old with the authority of the Republic. But in the chaos of the moment, expedience outweighed caution. For Salvidianus, this was the beginning of a new phase. He was no longer merely a competent commander in a stable hierarchy. He was now one of the keystones holding up Octavian's claim to legitimacy. The battles that followed were not grand affairs like the later confrontations at Actium. They were sharp, punishing clashes between forces that often knew each other too well. Civil war is an intimate form of conflict. The enemy is not a distant barbarian in unfamiliar armor, but a fellow Roman, perhaps even a former comrade. Salvidienus led his men against such adversaries with the cold clarity of a man who understood that sentiment had no place on the battlefield. Victory meant survival, and survival meant the continued rise of the man to whom he had bound his future. In 43 BC, the political balance shifted again. The Senate's temporary alliance with Octavian soured, and the young commander marched on Rome itself, forcing the body to grant him the consulship. Soon after, the second triumvirate was formed, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus dividing the Roman world between them. Officially, this was a pact of unity. In reality, it was a pause in a struggle all three men knew was inevitable. The proscriptions began, lists of enemies of the state whose deaths were sanctioned in the name of stability. Blood ran in the streets of Rome as political opponents were hunted down. For Salvidienus, the lesson was unmistakable. In this new order, loyalty was not a moral choice, but a survival mechanism. To falter in allegiance was to invite death. The campaigns that followed against Brutus and Cassius in the east were fought with the understanding that these were not just battles for territory, but for the soul of the Republic. Salvidienus, though not the most famous of Octavian's commanders, played a vital role in maintaining cohesion within the forces. Discipline under such strain was fragile. The soldiers were weary from years of campaigning, their loyalties tested by promises from every side. Salvidienus's ability to enforce order without breaking morale became one of his defining attributes. It was this steadiness, as much as his skill in logistics and maneuver, that kept Octavian's war machine functioning in those critical years. When Brutus and Cassius were finally defeated at Philippi in 42 BC, the second triumvirate stood unchallenged. Yet peace did not follow. The victors turned their attention to dividing the spoils, and the latent tensions between Octavian and Antony began to surface in earnest. Antony, controlling the eastern provinces, wrapped himself in the luxuries and politics of the Hellenistic world. Octavian, in the west, worked to solidify his control over Italy and the western provinces. Lepidus, sidelined and diminished, became little more than a nominal partner in the alliance. Salvidienus now found himself in a position of immense responsibility. His loyalty to Octavian had been proven in battle and in the quiet but essential work of governance. The young ruler rewarded him with commands of increasing scope, culminating in his appointment as governor of Gaul. It was a posting that signaled absolute trust. Gaul was rich, strategically positioned, and always in danger of unrest. To hold it securely required both military vigilance and political tact. From Gaul, Salvidienus could observe the widening rift between Octavian and Antony with a detached clarity. Letters and messengers carried news of Antony's deepening alliance with Cleopatra in Egypt, of Octavian's careful cultivation of public opinion in Rome, of the subtle maneuvers each man made to weaken the other's position. For a seasoned commander, these were not just reports, they were warning signs. Civil war, once again, was no longer a matter of if, but when. For Salvidienus, the years following Philippi must have felt like walking a ridgeline. On one side was the stability and favor he enjoyed under Octavian. On the other was the temptation of Antony's growing eastern power. Each step forward required balance, every decision weighed against the shifting winds of politics. In Rome, the populace was restless under the strain of endless wars. In the provinces, governors and commanders measured their loyalty not in ideals, but in the tangible rewards they could expect from their patrons. The strain of such a position cannot be underestimated. A governor's responsibilities extended far beyond the administration of justice and the collection of taxes. He was expected to maintain the loyalty of local elites, to secure the borders against external threats, to keep the legions ready for deployment at a moment's notice. He was also, inevitably, a political actor, one whose favor or disfavor could influence events far beyond his province. Salvidienus had risen high, but in the Republic's brutal hierarchy, the higher a man climbed, the further he could fall. It was in this atmosphere, tense, uncertain, and pregnant with the threat of renewed conflict, that Salvidienus's story began its fatal turn. The man who had once embodied disciplined loyalty, who had been entrusted with some of the most sensitive commands in Octavian's service, would soon take a step from which there could be no return. By the late 40s BC, Rome's maps were not merely parchment records of conquest. They were living, breathing indicators of ambition. Provinces were chess pieces, legions the arms of power. Whoever controlled the western provinces commanded the wealth of Gaul, Hispania, and Italy. Whoever commanded the east held the rich grain of Egypt, the silver of Asia Minor, and the trade routes that fed Rome's insatiable hunger for luxury. Salvidinus Rufus stood at the very center of this delicate equilibrium, holding one of the most vital positions in the Republic's unstable political landscape. His governorship of Gaul was no ceremonial honor. Gaul was the gatekeeper of the West. From its northern frontiers came the threat of Germanic tribes, unpredictable, swift in their raids, and unyielding in their resistance to Roman control. To the south, the great rivers and fertile lands were the arteries of trade and supply, feeding Rome's markets and armies alike. To govern Gaul was to keep one's hands firmly on the Republic's pulse. It required a man who could command legions, negotiate with tribal chieftains, and maintain the fragile loyalty of Roman settlers scattered across its vast expanse. Salvidianus approached the role with the same precision that had marked his earlier career. Fortifications were strengthened along the Rhine. Roads, the lifelines of Rome's military machine, were repaired and extended, ensuring that reinforcements could move swiftly from one end of the province to the other. His legions drilled relentlessly, not only to maintain readiness but to project an image of unshakable authority. In the provinces, appearance often preceded action. A display of power could prevent the need for its use. But Gaul was more than a military challenge. It was a political prize. News from Rome reached even the remotest forts, carried on the lips of traders, envoys, and opportunists. Antony's exploits in the east were becoming the stuff of both admiration and scandal. His alliance with Cleopatra was deepening, his attention fixed on Egypt's wealth and the glamour of the Hellenistic courts. Octavian, in contrast, remained in the west, presenting himself as the defender of traditional Roman values. Between them, the alliance that had once crushed Brutus and Cassius was rotting from within. Salvidianus, though distant from the capital, was far from a passive observer. Every decision he made in Gaul had ripples in Rome. The legions he commanded were not merely provincial garrisons, they were a potential kingmaker's army. In a republic where military force had become the ultimate arbiter of political disputes, his loyalty was a commodity of immense value. It was during this period of strategic significance that Octavian bestowed upon him the ultimate mark of trust, the consulship for 39 BC. To a man of noble birth, the consulship was the culmination of generations of privilege and political maneuvering. To Salvidianus, born without such advantages, it was the summit of an improbable ascent. The office placed him at the very peak of the Roman hierarchy. Co-equal with the most powerful men in the state, his name inscribed alongside theirs in the Fasti, the official record of Rome's magistrates. The elevation was more than symbolic. As consul, Salvidianus was entrusted with the execution of state policy, the oversight of legislation, and the coordination of military campaigns. His voice carried the weight of the Republic itself. In the Senate, he stood shoulder to shoulder with men who had once dismissed him as an upstart from obscurity. Now they bowed to protocol and addressed him with the deference owed to his office. Yet the consulship was not without its dangers. It made him visible, not just to allies, but to rivals. In Rome, prominence was a double-edged sword. To shine too brightly was to invite suspicion. Every action was scrutinized, every decision dissected for hidden motives. For a man like Salvidianus, who owed his rise to the patronage of Octavian, the position was also a test of loyalty. Would he remain the steadfast lieutenant who had served through years of civil war? Or would the taste of supreme power awaken ambitions that no patron could fully control? For the moment, Salvidianus seemed determined to justify Octavian's faith. His administration was marked by efficiency and decisiveness. He worked to stabilize Gaul's internal politics, smoothing over disputes between Roman settlers and local tribes, while maintaining the legions at peak readiness. Tribute flowed steadily to Rome, and reports from the province spoke of order and prosperity. In the capital, these successes reflected well on Octavian's leadership, strengthening his position against Antony's growing influence in the east. Still, beneath the surface, the fault lines of the triumvirate widened. Antony's critics painted him as a man seduced by Eastern decadence, neglecting his Roman duties for the charms of Cleopatra. Octavian's supporters, meanwhile, framed their leader as the true guardian of the Republic's traditions, uncorrupted by foreign luxuries. The propaganda war was as fierce as any fought with swords, and Salvidienus's position in Gaul placed him squarely in the middle of it. His legions were a tempting asset for both sides. For Octavian, they were a shield against Antony's potential aggression. For Antony, they represented the possibility of tipping the balance of power should hostilities break out. Salvidienus, whether he admitted it or not, had become a man courted by history itself. In the camps along the Rhine, life followed the relentless rhythm of the Roman military machine. Soldiers rose at dawn, their breath misting in the cold air, and began the day's drills. Patrols moved along the frontier, eyes sharp for signs of tribal movement. In the towns, merchants traded goods brought from as far as Alexandria and Britannia. The hum of commerce mingled with the clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the barked commands of centurions drilling their men in the forum. It was a world balanced between Roman order and the untamed lands beyond. Salvidienus thrived in this environment. He was not a man given to grand public displays or the cultivation of personal myth, but he understood the value of presence. He toured the province regularly, inspecting fortifications, reviewing troops, and meeting with local leaders. These journeys were as much about perception as practicality. The sight of the governor, the consul, in person, was a reminder of Rome's reach and authority. It also reinforced the bond between Salvidienus and his soldiers, a bond forged in the shared hardships of the frontier. But with prestige came pressure. In every decision, he had to consider not only the immediate consequences, but also the political ramifications in Rome. A governor who acted without regard for the capital's shifting alliances could find himself recalled, accused, or worse. Salvidienus was careful, but he was also human. The higher he climbed, the more he must have felt the weight of what he had achieved, and the gnawing awareness that in the volatile world of the late Republic, even the most trusted men could fall in a heartbeat. The consulship elevated his name across the empire, but it also tied his fate more tightly to Octavian's. As tensions with Antony moved from veiled hostility to open maneuvering, Salvidienus's loyalty would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. The very skills that had brought him to prominence, his ability to command, to administer, to navigate political complexity, would soon be called upon in a situation where the wrong choice could mean not just the loss of office, but the loss of life. For now, however, he stood at the pinnacle. His legions were strong, his province orderly, his political star ascendant. The boy from obscurity had become a consul of Rome, the trusted arm of its most powerful man in the West. It was the kind of rise that poets might praise and enemies might envy. In the marble halls of the capital and the wind-swept fortresses of Gaul alike, his name carried the ring of authority. And yet, in the quiet moments, in the governor's private chambers, in the silence of his tent on the frontier, perhaps he already sensed the truth. That in Rome's ceaseless struggle for supremacy, glory was never an end in itself. It was only ever a pause before the next battle. And for a man in his position, the next battle would not be fought against foreign tribes or rebellious provinces, but in the treacherous arena of Roman politics, where the enemy could be the very man who had once called you friend. The alliance that had once stood as a wall against chaos was now crumbling from within. The second triumvirate, Octavian in the west, Antony in the east, Lepidus as the nominal third, had been forged in the fires of vengeance, its first purpose the destruction of Brutus and Cassius. That purpose had been fulfilled years before. What remained was an arrangement held together not by unity of vision, but by a wary calculation of mutual benefit. And as Rome's enemies abroad receded, the enemies within each man's thoughts grew sharper in definition. From Gaul, Salvidienus could feel the shifting weight of this fragile structure. Messages arrived from Rome thick with implication, each line carrying more than it seemed to say. Envoys traveled with guarded expressions, their words chosen carefully, their loyalty difficult to read. The triumvirate's official decrees spoke of continued cooperation, but the tone of Octavian's private dispatches had changed. The urgency was sharper now, the instructions more exacting, as though each decision in the provinces might tip an unseen balance in the capital. Antony's name appeared more frequently in those communications, not as the trusted comrade who had once fought shoulder to shoulder with Octavian, but as a looming force, unpredictable, ambitious, dangerous. From the east came tales of his splendor in Alexandria, of Cleopatra's influence over him, of the fleets and armies gathering under his command. The stories were often colored by Octavian's propaganda, yet even stripped of exaggeration, they painted a portrait of a man positioning himself for the day when the triumvirate would dissolve into open war. Lepidus, meanwhile, was fading into irrelevance. Stripped of much of his power after a failed political maneuver, he lingered as a figurehead, a reminder that even among the victors of Philippi, survival was not guaranteed. In Rome's unforgiving political climate, irrelevance was merely the quiet path to extinction. His fate was a warning to all, Salvidienus included. Power was not a possession, but a condition maintained by constant vigilance. The frontiers of Gaul were quiet during these years, at least by the standards of a Roman governor. There were the occasional skirmishes with tribes testing the boundaries of Roman authority, the usual intrigues among local chieftains, but nothing to threaten the stability of the province. This relative calm left Salvidienus with more time to think, to weigh the winds blowing from Rome, to consider the widening chasm between the two dominant figures of his age. Octavian had been his patron, the man whose rise he had served with discipline and loyalty. But loyalty in the late Republic was not an immutable oath. It was a currency, exchanged and renegotiated as circumstances demanded. And circumstances were changing. Antony's position in the east was formidable. The wealth of Egypt, the grain of the Nile, the tribute of Asia, the naval strength of the eastern Mediterranean. For a man ambitious enough to imagine himself more than a governor, Antony's shadow could seem less a threat than an opportunity. The temptation was not immediate, nor was it born of simple greed. Men like Salvidienus calculated risks in layers, weighing not only the rewards of a decision but the pathways it might open and close. Octavian's dominance in the west was secure, but his resources were not infinite. Antony's alliances in the east, however volatile, gave him reach into regions whose wealth dwarfed that of Italy. And in the inevitable war between them, the side that commanded the larger share of Rome's legions would dictate the peace to follow. In the capital, propaganda sharpened into a weapon. Octavian's supporters portrayed Antony as a man corrupted by foreign luxuries, his Roman virtues eroded by the seductions of Cleopatra's court. Antony's allies countered with whispers of Octavian's ruthless ambition, his willingness to sacrifice the Republic's traditions for personal gain. The people of Rome, weary from years of instability, were caught between competing narratives, neither entirely trusted yet both impossible to ignore. Salvidienus watched these developments with the eye of a soldier accustomed to reading the battlefield. The battlefield now was political, but the principles were the same. Know the terrain, anticipate the enemy's movement, secure your lines of retreat. He strengthened his grip on Gaul, ensuring that the province remained orderly and that its legions were well provisioned. A commander who let his troops grow lax in peacetime would be unprepared when the call to arms came. Yet even as he maintained outward loyalty to Octavian, there were signs, subtle, almost imperceptible, that his calculations were expanding. Certain envoys from the east received more careful attention than others. Certain communications took longer to reply to, their contents weighed with unusual deliberation. Salvidienus was not yet acting against Octavian, but the architecture of possibility was being built in his mind. Gaul, under his administration, remained a model of Roman order. Markets bustled in the provincial towns, supplying both civilian life and the military machine. Roads stretched farther, linking outposts with speed and efficiency. Patrols along the Rhine projected Roman strength into the lands of the tribes, a constant reminder that the empire's reach was both vast and vigilant. This stability gave Salvidianus freedom to observe, to reflect, to quietly take measure of the two men whose contest would define Rome's future. Octavian, for his part, still trusted him. That trust had been forged over years of service, of battles fought and provinces secured. But trust in Rome was not the same as friendship. It was a function of utility, maintained only so long as the other man's interests aligned with your own. Salvidianus understood this, just as he understood that Antony, for all his flaws, valued the loyalty of capable commanders as much as Octavian did. To a man in his position, the question was never simply, "Whom do I serve?" but, "Where does my service yield the greatest return?" The distance between Gaul and Rome, once a safeguard from the capital's intrigues, began to feel like an isolation. Salvidianus received news only after it had passed through many hands, filtered and shaped by the biases of those who carried it. This delay created both frustration and opportunity. Frustration, because decisions in the capital could affect the provinces before word even arrived. Opportunity, because in the gap between information and action lay the space to maneuver without immediate oversight. In this atmosphere, the first faint threads of betrayal were spun, not yet woven into action, but stretched across the landscape of possibility. Antony's agents were everywhere in the east, and some of them, inevitably, passed through Gaul. Conversations could be casual, couched in the language of diplomacy and courtesy, but beneath the surface they tested the boundaries of allegiance. What would Gaul's legions do if called upon to march east? How firm was Salvidianus's bond to Octavian? Could a man of his standing envision a different arrangement for Rome's future? For now, such questions had no public answer. Salvidianus continued to serve Octavian with outward loyalty, his administration in Gaul a testament to Roman discipline and efficiency. But in the corridors of his mind, the map of Rome's power was being redrawn. The old alliances were eroding, the old certainties fading. Somewhere ahead lay the moment when choosing a side would no longer be avoidable. And when that moment came, it would not be decided by sentiment or by the memory of past service. It would be decided by the cold arithmetic of survival, and by the vision of where a man like Salvidianus might stand when the dust of civil war settled once more over the ancient stones of Rome. The winter in Gaul was long and cold. Snow lay heavy on the fort roofs along the Rhine, and the river itself ran sluggish and dark under the weight of ice. In the governor's residence at Lugdunum, the fires burned constantly, their smoke curling upward into the rafters and out through the narrow chimneys. Salvidianus spent more time indoors that season than in any before, not out of weakness, but because Gaul was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The border tribes stirred only occasionally, the markets were steady, and the legions, well-fed and well-drilled, had little to do beyond their usual patrols and exercises. It was in that stillness that the temptation began to take form. News from the east arrived with the caravans and the diplomatic couriers. The name of Antony was everywhere in those reports. Antony hosting banquets in Alexandria, Antony reviewing fleets in the harbors of the Levant, Antony crowned in Egyptian ceremony beside Cleopatra. The tone of the messengers varied depending on their allegiance. Some spoke with contempt, as if Antony were nothing more than a Roman in thrall to a foreign queen. Others, especially traders who had seen the wealth of Egypt firsthand, spoke in tones of awe. Salvidianus listened to them all. He was not a man easily swayed by flattery or spectacle, but he understood the language of power. Antony's eastern command was vast and rich. The grain fleets from Egypt alone could feed half the Roman world. His legions, many of them hardened veterans of past campaigns, were loyal and well-provisioned. And unlike Octavian, who still depended heavily on the Senate's delicate tolerance, Antony ruled his territories with a freer hand, unburdened by the constant negotiations of Roman domestic politics. For a provincial governor commanding legions of his own, the implications were clear. In the next civil war, and there would be a next. Antony would not be the weaker party. The thought was not yet treason, but it was the seed from which treason could grow. Salvidianus had built his life on loyalty to Octavian. He had fought for him, bled for him, governed for him. But loyalty in the late Republic was not the virtue it had once been in the days of the old Republic's rigid traditions. It was a transaction, and every transaction could be renegotiated. He began to weigh the two men in his mind. Octavian was shrewd, calculating, and relentless in pursuit of power. His victories had been won as much through political maneuvering as through battlefield skill. He valued discipline and control, but he was also quick to discard allies who no longer served his purpose. Antony, by contrast, was a soldier's commander, charismatic, decisive, and willing to reward loyalty with real wealth and influence. His style was more personal, less restrained by the machinery of the Senate. The question Salvidianus asked himself in the quiet hours was not, "Which man do I prefer?" but "Which man will win?" For in Rome, it was not enough to serve the side you believed in. You had to serve the side that would still exist when the fighting ended. The temptation deepened when certain envoys began to pass through Gaul. Men from the east whose business in the province was always described in vague terms. Trade agreements, diplomatic discussions, military coordination against common enemies. They brought with them gifts, fine textiles from the markets of Antioch, rare spices from Arabia, coins stamped with Antony's likeness alongside Cleopatra's. These were not bribes, not yet, but they were reminders of the opulence and reach of the eastern provinces. Salvidianus accepted them politely, as protocol demanded, and in doing so, he opened the smallest of doors. Once opened, that door could never truly be shut. He began to imagine the potential shape of things if he shifted his allegiance. Gaul's legions, loyal to their commander, could be moved south into Italy or east toward the Alps. Their presence could change the calculations of any Roman campaign. In a war between Octavian and Antony, the defection of Gaul would be a decisive blow, perhaps the blow that determined the outcome before the first great battle was fought. The idea was intoxicating not because it promised an easy victory, but because it promised relevance. Salvidianus had climbed higher than anyone of his birth could have dreamed. Yet in Octavian's Rome, he was still, in some unspoken way, a subordinate, a servant of another man's destiny. Antony's court in the east, by contrast, was filled with powerful allies who had carved their own paths, men whose loyalty had been bought with command, territory, and wealth. The more he considered it, the more the decision began to take on the shape of inevitability. Octavian's control of the West was strong, but it was not absolute. His grip on Italy was complicated by land disputes among veterans and political factions in Rome. The Senate tolerated him, but did not love him. If Antony moved west with his fleets and his grain, promising stability and plenty, Rome's people might not resist. And if Antony arrived with Gaul already in his camp, the war could be short. Salvidianus was too experienced to act on impulse. He understood the dangers of premature commitment. A word in the wrong ear, a letter intercepted, a courier bribed. Any of these could bring ruin. So he began cautiously, feeling for the edges of Antony's willingness without stepping beyond the point of no return. Messages were sent through intermediaries, phrased in ways that could be denied if necessary. The offers were not explicit, but their meaning was clear enough to anyone versed in the language of Roman politics. In these messages, Salvidianus hinted at the possibility of friendship, of cooperation in the event of unavoidable conflict. He spoke of Gaul's strategic importance and the readiness of its legions. He suggested that he was open to mutual benefit should circumstances change. Antony, or more likely his agents, responded with guarded interest. Nothing was promised, nothing committed, but the line of communication was established. And once established, it was only a matter of time. What Salvidianus may not have fully grasped, or perhaps underestimated, was the efficiency of Octavian's intelligence network. The young leader was many things, but above all, he was a master of information. Spies, informants, and political allies fed him a constant stream of reports from across the empire. Every letter, every conversation of significance had the potential to be overheard, copied, or betrayed. The act of opening that door to Antony's court was the first real step toward his downfall. But in the moment, it must have felt like the beginning of a grand opportunity. The quiet of that winter in Gaul became the calm before the storm, a silence in which Salvidienus's mind turned endlessly over the possibilities. Each day he weighed his loyalty against his ambition. Each night he considered the risk against the reward. By the time the snows began to melt and the roads reopened, the temptation was no longer a passing thought. It had hardened into a plan, not yet executed, but ready. In his mind, the pieces were already moving. The envoys, the letters, the legions that would march when the time came. The betrayal had begun in the shadows, with whispers and cautious overtures. It would end in the full light of Roman politics, where there was no mercy for men who were caught trying to play both sides. For now, however, Salvidienus still walked in both worlds. To Octavian, he remained the loyal governor of Gaul, a trusted ally and friend. To Antony's agents, he was a potential prize, a commander whose defection could alter the fate of the empire. The road between those two identities was narrow, treacherous, and lined with the wreckage of men who had tried to walk it before. But Salvidienus believed himself different, clever enough, careful enough to make it across. History would prove him wrong. The first step was a letter. It was not long, nor was it written in the florid style of Roman orators. It was concise, deliberate, and above all, deniable. The language was carefully chosen, nothing overt enough to serve as direct evidence, but everything implied. Salvidienus understood the art of writing to two audiences, the one who received the words and the one who might intercept them. If the letter fell into unfriendly hands, it could be explained away as a simple diplomatic overture. If it reached its intended reader, its meaning would be unmistakable. It was addressed not to Mark Antony himself, but to a trusted intermediary, a man whose loyalty to Antony was well known in the eastern provinces. In it, Salvidienus spoke of the shared burdens of military command, of the need for unity in the face of inevitable challenges. He wrote of Gaul's readiness, of his own willingness to act in the interest of Rome's peace and stability, should certain political realities change. Nowhere did he use the word defection, but in the political language of the late Republic, he didn't need to. The offer lay between the lines. The courier who carried it was chosen with equal care. Not a legionary from Gaul, too easy to trace. Not a Roman citizen of note, too many eyes would follow him. Instead, a trader of Narbo, one who regularly traveled between the western ports and the eastern markets, accustomed to slipping unnoticed through the bustling exchanges of Massilia, Ostia, and Rhodes. The letter was hidden within a packet of trade documents, indistinguishable from the dozens of others that passed through customs every day. From the moment the courier departed Lugdunum, the betrayal was no longer a thought or a possibility. It was in motion, riding the frozen roads south, crossing the harbors and islands of the Mediterranean, heading toward the court of the man Octavian now called his most dangerous rival. For days, Salvidienus kept his outward routine unchanged. He reviewed troop reports, inspected the winter granaries, received delegations from Gallic towns. To his officers and staff, nothing seemed amiss. But in his private moments, the reality of what he had done began to press upon him. There was no way to call the letter back. If Antony accepted the offer, the course would be set. If Antony rejected it, or worse, revealed it, Salvidienus's life would be forfeit. Antony's reception of the letter is lost to history. We know only that he learned of it, and that Octavian did as well. How Octavian came into possession of its contents remains a matter of speculation. Perhaps Antony, suspicious of Salvidienus's motives, decided to use the overture as a weapon, passing it directly to his rival to undermine the governor's position. Perhaps one of Antony's agents betrayed their master for gold or favor. Or perhaps Octavian's own network of spies intercepted the letter before it ever reached its destination, delivering it into his hands intact. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Octavian now held in his possession a weapon more potent than any sword, proof, or at least the suggestion, that one of his most trusted generals was prepared to abandon him. Octavian's response was swift and calculated. There was no public outburst, no rash declaration. He understood that the handling of this betrayal would be as important as the betrayal itself. Salvidinus was not some minor functionary. He was a consul, a governor, a man whose legions were vital to the security of the West. To move against him without preparation could risk mutiny or unrest in Gaul. Instead, Octavian began to prepare the political ground. In Rome, whispers began to circulate. Not shouted accusations, but quiet suggestions, questions asked in the Senate corridors. Was Salvidienus entirely loyal? Had he perhaps grown too powerful, too independent? These murmurs spread subtly but steadily, shaping the perception of those who might soon be called to judgment. Meanwhile, Octavian summoned Salvidienus to Rome under the guise of consultation. A matter of urgent state business, he claimed, requiring the governor's presence in the capital. It was a summons that could not be refused without admitting suspicion. And so Salvidienus began the long journey south, leaving behind the fortress cities and frontier camps that had been the foundation of his power. In the capital, the stage was being set. The Senate, though often manipulated by the powerful, still served as the formal arbiter of charges as grave as treason. Octavian, ever conscious of appearances, intended to use that body as the instrument of condemnation. By presenting the evidence, however filtered, to Rome's governing assembly, he could cloak his personal vengeance in the authority of the Republic. For Salvidienus, the journey must have been heavy with uncertainty. Did Antony receive the letter? Had word of it reached Rome, or was this summons truly nothing more than political business? In the absence of certainty, he could only maintain his composure and prepare for every possibility. When he arrived in the city, the change in the air would have been impossible to miss. Senators who had once greeted him warmly now offered curt nods. Conversations fell silent when he approached. Even in the forum, where political theater was a daily ritual, the tension was sharper, the glances more calculating. Somewhere in the heart of the city, the machinery of his destruction was already turning. The Senate session in which Octavian made his move is not described in detail by the surviving sources, but we can imagine it. Octavian rising, the room falling to a hush. His voice measured, deliberate, never allowing anger to overpower the calculated weight of his words. He spoke of loyalty, of the sacred trust between Rome and her generals, of the dangers that faced the Republic in these perilous times. And then, the revelation. The letter, or at least an account of its contents, laid before the Senate. Salvidienus named his offer to Antony described as nothing less than an attempt to deliver Gaul into the hands of a rival. The chamber would have erupted, some in outrage, others in shock, a few perhaps in satisfaction. For the Senate, the decision was swift. A declaration of hostis publicus, public enemy. It was the ultimate political death sentence, stripping Salvidienus of office, command, and protection under Roman law. From that moment, any man loyal to Rome had the right to kill him without trial. For Salvidienus, the mask of power had been torn away in a single afternoon. The governor of Gaul, the consul of Rome, the man whose name had been spoken with respect in the halls of power, was now an outlaw in the eyes of the state he had served. The betrayal was no longer a matter of whispers and shadows. It was written into the official record of the Republic, sealed with the authority of the Senate, and backed by the might of Octavian's political machine. What followed remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he was arrested immediately upon leaving the Senate. Others claim he was given the chance to take his own life, the Roman way of sparing himself the humiliation of public execution. Whichever path it was, the end came quickly. The letter that had set the betrayal in motion had also sealed its fate. The title Hostis Publicus, public enemy, was not simply a legal designation. It was an erasure. From the moment the Senate pronounced those words, Salvidienus ceased to exist in the eyes of the Republic as a citizen, a consul, a a governor, a man of honor. What remained was a target stripped of every privilege and protection he had once enjoyed. It was as though the years of service, the campaigns fought, the provinces governed, had been swept away by a single motion of the Senate's hand. In Rome, the verdict spread quickly. The city streets, always attuned to shifts in power, whispered the news before the formal announcements could be posted. In the Forum, where he had once walked with the confidence of a man whose name was etched in the Fasti Consulares, Salvidienus was now spoken of as a traitor. Merchants who had once courted his favor now looked past him as though he were invisible. Senators who had dined at his table turned their faces away. It was a strange and brutal thing, the speed with which Rome could unmake a man. In the army, reputations were forged in years and could survive even a crushing defeat. In politics, they could be destroyed in an afternoon. And in Salvidienus's case, it was not only the Senate's condemnation that struck him down, but the quiet, deliberate withdrawal of every thread that had held him in the fabric of Roman society. Allies went silent. Friends found pressing reasons to be elsewhere. Even family connections offered no shield. There was no trial, no defense to be mounted. The Senate's declaration had been the trial, the verdict, and the sentence all in one. Octavian, careful to maintain the appearance of legality, had given the Republic its role in condemning the traitor. But it was clear to everyone, perhaps even to Salvidienus himself, that the decision had been made long before he entered the chamber. The letter had sealed his fate. The Senate had merely delivered it. Now the city was no longer safe for him. Guards once loyal to him now obeyed orders from Octavian's men. His home in Rome, with its marble atrium and collection of provincial trophies, was confiscated, the contents inventoried for seizure. Every coin, every possession was declared the property of the state. His accounts were frozen, his estates forfeited. Even the statues erected in his honor were subject to destruction, their faces smashed, their inscriptions chiseled away. Rome did not simply punish traitors, it erased them from memory. Yet the greatest blow was not material. It was the loss of identity. Salvidienus had been a soldier, a commander, a consul. Roles that gave shape to his life, that defined how others saw him and how he saw himself. Now, stripped of those titles, he was left with nothing but his own thoughts. And in those thoughts, the same question turned over and over. Where had the calculation failed? Had Antony betrayed him to Octavian? Had Octavian's spies been too well placed? Or had the plan been doomed from the moment he allowed the idea to take root in his mind? In the narrow rooms where he now found himself confined, whether a guarded house or a prison cell, the sources are unclear, the world grew smaller. The clamor of the Forum, the ordered bustle of the legions, the vast sweep of the provinces, all of it was replaced by the measured tread of guards outside the door, the muted voices of servants who no longer spoke to him directly, the cold draft seeping through cracks in the stone walls. He would have known what awaited him. A man declared Hostis Publicus had two possible ends: execution at the hands of the state, or the grim mercy of suicide. In the old Republic, taking one's own life under such circumstances was not merely an escape. It was an assertion of control over the manner of one's end. It spared one's family the full weight of confiscation, preserved a measure of dignity, and denied the state the spectacle of a public death. But it also required a final acceptance, an acknowledgement that the game was over. For Salvidienus, the days that followed must have been filled with a peculiar kind of waiting. There was no battle to fight, no strategy to employ, no appeal to make. His fate rested entirely in the hands of the man he had once served, the man whose trust he had betrayed. And Octavian was not known for leniency. His political survival had been built on eliminating threats before they could rise again. Salvidienus, with his command of Gaul's legions and his willingness to entertain alliance with Antony, had been such a threat. News from the provinces would have been slow to reach him, but he might have heard whispers that Gaul was already in the process of being reassigned, its legions placed under a new governor loyal to Octavian, that Antony's eastern court had made no move to avenge or rescue him, that in the eyes of both men whose favor he had once sought, he was now of no use. There is a particular cruelty in being abandoned by both sides in a contest. It leaves no path for redemption, no hope of bargaining for one's life. Salvadinus was not the first to find himself in this position, and he would not be the last. In Rome's endless cycle of alliances and betrayals, yesterday's indispensable ally could become today's expendable enemy in the time it took to read a single letter. As the days shortened, the final choice drew nearer. Whether the order came directly from Octavian, or whether it was left unsaid, the expectation was clear. Salvidianus would end his own life. It was, in a way, the last command he would ever receive, and the last opportunity to obey. We can imagine the final moments, the chamber lit by a single oil lamp, its flickering light casting long shadows on the walls, the quiet scrape of a blade being drawn, the heavy stillness of the air broken only by the sound of his own breathing, and the thoughts, not of glory or ambition now, but of the long road from obscurity to the consulship, of the battles fought and won, of the choices made in the belief that they would lead to greater things. Outside, Rome continued as it always had. The markets opened with the dawn. Senators gathered to debate matters of state. Soldiers drilled in the fields beyond the city. The life of the Republic moved forward, indifferent to the fall of one man. When it was over, there would be no funeral procession, no eulogy in the Forum. His name would be spoken only in cautionary tones, a warning to those who might one day think to balance loyalty against ambition. The Senate's records would note the charge and the sentence. The details would fade. And in Gaul, the legions that had once looked to him for command would march under new standards, their loyalty transferred without ceremony. For Salvidianus, the title Hostus Publicus had been more than a sentence. It had been the stripping away of everything that made him who he was. In that, perhaps, lay the true punishment. Not the manner of his death, but the certainty that, in the eyes of the Republic, he had already ceased to exist long before the end. The corridors outside his quarters had grown quiet. For days there had been movement. Guards posted at the entrance, the occasional servant arriving with food or water, the distant murmur of voices as instructions passed between those tasked with watching him. But now the air felt different. The footsteps were fewer, the glances more deliberate. It was the stillness of something decided but not yet spoken aloud. Salvidianus knew what it meant. He had known from the moment the Senate's decree was pronounced that there would be no reprieve. Rome was a city where ambition might be tolerated, even celebrated, so long as it served the interests of the powerful. But betrayal, especially one that threatened the balance of power in a time of looming civil war, was a debt the Republic demanded be paid in full, and Octavian, methodical and cold when it came to removing obstacles, would not leave this debt unpaid. The hours passed slowly. The room he occupied was plain, too plain for a man who, not long before, had commanded the wealth and resources of an entire province. The bed was narrow, the walls bare, the light from the single window thin and pale. He could hear the sounds of the city beyond, the clip of hooves on stone streets, the occasional shout from the Forum, the clang of the blacksmiths plying their trade. The city's life went on without him, indifferent to the narrowing boundaries of his own. There was no ceremony to mark the arrival of the end, no official reading of charges, no procession of magistrates. Instead, there was a subtle shift. The guard who brought his meal that day avoided meeting his gaze. The officer at the door stood a little straighter, a little more alert. Rome's way was often to let the condemned walk toward their fate without announcing it, to give them the illusion of choice in how they met it. That illusion was all that remained to him now. For a Roman of his standing, there were only two acceptable exits from such a position: execution, or the quiet, deliberate act of ending one's own life. The latter was the final assertion of agency in a system that had stripped away everything else. It was the difference between being paraded as a criminal through the streets and leaving the world on one's own terms. It was the last decision a condemned man could make without permission. Salvidinus had seen others make that choice. He had served alongside generals who, faced with defeat, chose the blade over the chains. He had heard the whispered accounts of those who drank poison in the night, leaving behind nothing but a body for the authorities to find in the morning. In the Roman mind, this was not cowardice. It was discipline, a kind of final loyalty to one's own dignity. The day faded into evening. The pale winter light drained from the window, replaced by the orange flicker of the oil lamp in the corner. Shadows stretched across the walls, shifting with the movements of the flame. Salvadinus sat at the small wooden table, his hands resting on its surface, the weight of them heavy. His thoughts moved not to the specifics of the betrayal, but to the long arc of his life. He thought of his beginnings, obscure, unremarkable, without the noble lineage that opened doors in the capital. Of the first time he had marched with the legions, the smell of leather and iron in the air, the sound of boots on the packed earth of the road. Of the slow accumulation of trust and responsibility, the long winters on the frontier, the heat and dust of campaigns far from home. He thought of Octavian, younger then, still earning his place among Rome's power brokers. Of the early battles, the tense councils of war, the long days when the outcome of each campaign seemed uncertain. Of the moment when Octavian had looked to him not merely as a soldier, but as a man capable of governing in his name. It had been more than trust. It had been a signal that Salvadinus had reached the inner circle, that he had stepped fully into the machinery that determined Rome's future. And then he thought of the slow drift, the letters from the east, the accounts of Antony's fleets, his legions, his treasures, the questions whispered by envoys about where Gaul's loyalties might lie in the event of a division. The thought that had first seemed like an idle calculation, a soldier's instinct to weigh the balance of power, growing heavier, more solid, until it became a decision. A letter written, a courier dispatched, the point of no return crossed. Perhaps he had misjudged Antony's willingness to protect him. Perhaps Antony had never truly intended to draw him into his camp, seeing him instead as a bargaining chip to weaken Octavian. Or perhaps Antony had simply been too distant, too distracted by the politics of the East to react before Octavian's intelligence network closed around the betrayal. It no longer mattered. On the table before him lay a short dagger, the same kind a soldier might carry on campaign, simple and functional. It had been placed there without comment earlier in the day, as if it had always been part of the room's furnishings. But its presence was a message as clear as any spoken order. No one would come in to force his hand. No one would drag him to the forum. The choice was his, but the expectation was absolute. He reached for it slowly, the weight familiar in his grip. The metal was cool, the handle worn smooth from years of use. He turned it in his hand, watching the lamplight catch on the blade's edge. There was no fear now, only a deep and quiet exhaustion. The climb had been long, the fall swift, and the landing absolute. In that moment there was nothing of the consul, the governor, the commander. There was only the man, stripped of office, of allies, of the illusions that had once wrapped around him like armor. The man who had risen from obscurity by his own skill, who had stood at the side of one of Rome's most powerful leaders, and who had miscalculated the one thing that mattered most in the Republic, where to place his loyalty when the winds changed. The blade hovered for a moment longer, a breath caught in the space between thought and action, and then it was done. The guards would find him as the oil lamp burned low, its flame casting a last wavering light across the small room. They would send word to Octavian, who would mark the matter closed. In Gaul, the new governor would take command of the legions without ceremony. In the Senate, there would be no debate. In the records, his name would carry the brand of treason, and the details of his end would fade into the margins. Outside, the city would wake as it always did. The sun would rise over the forum. Merchants would open their stalls. Senators would gather in the Curia to argue over matters of law and empire. The Republic would continue its endless cycle of ambition and ruin, unmoved by the silence left in the wake of one man's fall. And in that silence lay the truth of Rome. No matter how high a man climbed, the distance to the ground was always shorter than he imagined. The death of Quintus Salvius Salvidianus Rufus did not echo through the streets of Rome. It did not cause riots, nor did it inspire public mourning. It was not announced from the rostra, nor marked by any ceremony that would acknowledge his years of service. It slipped into the city's bloodstream like a whisper, carried in guarded tones between men who understood that in Rome, certain deaths were not meant to be spoken of loudly. Octavian ensured it would be so. For Octavian, the removal of Salvidienus was not merely the punishment of a traitor. It was a demonstration. The governor of Gaul had been one of his most trusted commanders, a man who had fought beside him during the critical early campaigns of his career, who had been elevated to the consulship itself. If such a man could be struck down for disloyalty, what did that say to the rest of his officers, governors, and political allies? The message was plain. No one was too close to be beyond suspicion. No one was too valuable to be beyond reach. In the Senate, the matter was officially closed. The record would show that Salvidienus had been declared hostis publicus and had died soon after. The details left deliberately vague. The confiscation of his property was finalized, the spoils divided between the state and the coffers of Octavian's administration. His name was removed from any public inscriptions that still bore it. His statues toppled or defaced. The Rome that once celebrated his victories now erased him with the same efficiency it had used to elevate him. In Gaul, the transition was swift. Octavian appointed a new governor, a man whose loyalty was proven beyond doubt, and whose political ambition did not extend beyond his station. The legions that had once marched under Salvidienus's standards adapted without protest. Soldiers in Rome's armies were loyal to their commanders, yes, but they were also loyal to their pay, their rations, and their future rewards. In the Republic's long history, the death or disgrace of a commander was simply another turn in the cycle. The banners changed, the orders came from a different voice, and the machine of empire continued. Antony's reaction, or lack thereof, was telling. If Salvidienus had expected Antony to use the affair as a weapon against Octavian, he had misjudged his would-be ally. Antony said nothing in public. There were no speeches in the East condemning Octavian's treatment of a Roman commander, no gestures of outrage over the execution or forced suicide. Antony may have recognized that Salvidienus's overtures were more liability than asset. To defend him would have been to confirm Octavian's accusations. To acknowledge the letter would have been to admit to secret communications that could undermine Antony's own position. It is possible that Antony had even been the one to expose Salvidienus in the first place, sending word of the offer to Octavian not out of loyalty, but as a calculated move to sow distrust among Octavian's inner circle. If so, it had been a success. Salvidienus was gone, and Octavian's other generals would think twice before making their own overtures eastward. The people of Rome, for their part, absorbed the news in the way they absorbed all such matters, with a brief flicker of interest, followed by indifference. The city's attention was already shifting to the next spectacle, the next political maneuver, the next rumor from the East. Civil wars had taught them to be pragmatic about the turnover of names in the halls of power. Men rose, men fell, and the Republic, or what remained of it, continued. For those who had known Salvidienus personally, the silence was perhaps more difficult. Fellow officers who had campaigned with him might have felt the loss in private, remembering his discipline, his command in battle, the long marches endured together. But to speak openly in his defense was to risk association with a man branded a traitor. In Rome, guilt could be contagious. Better to remain quiet, to let the memory fade. Octavian wasted no time in folding the affair into his larger political strategy. In private conversations with senators, he used the example of Salvidienus to reinforce his warnings about Antony's ambition and duplicity. Here, he would say without saying, was proof that Antony sought to undermine the West by turning its commanders. If Salvidienus had succeeded, Gaul's legions might now be marching under Antony's orders. The danger was real, and vigilance was essential. The story became a tool, sharpened, reshaped, and wielded not as an account of what had happened, but as a warning of what might have been. In the hands of a man like Octavian, it became part of a narrative. Antony was a seducer of Rome's loyalty, a destabilizing force whose influence had to be countered at every turn. Beyond politics, the personal consequences for Salvidienus's family were immediate. Whatever property had not been seized outright was likely subject to legal challenges. His relatives would have found themselves suddenly unwelcome in certain circles, their own prospects diminished by the stain of his condemnation. In a city where reputation was as valuable as wealth, the loss of one could quickly lead to the loss of the other. And then there was the matter of memory, the slow erasure that was perhaps more final than death itself. Official histories, often written under the influence or direct patronage of those in power, would record Salvidienus's name only in the context of his betrayal. His earlier service, his role in Octavian's rise, his governance of Gaul, all would be overshadowed by the act that ended his career. For future generations, he would be not the general who secured the western provinces, but the traitor whose ambitions outpaced his judgment. In this way, Octavian's victory over Salvidinus extended beyond the physical removal of a rival. It reached into the realm of legacy, ensuring that the story would be told on his terms. To control the narrative was to control history itself, and Octavian, who would one day become Augustus, understood this better than anyone. In the East, Antony likely saw the incident as a minor skirmish in the greater contest. One less potential ally in Gaul was an inconvenience, but not a decisive blow. His focus remained on consolidating his position in Egypt, strengthening his fleets, and preparing for the eventual confrontation with Octavian. Salvidienus's death, in this light, was little more than a footnote in the slow march toward a war that would engulf the entire Roman world. Yet in that footnote lay a cautionary truth, one that other commanders could not ignore. In the game being played between Octavian and Antony, there was no safe middle ground. To hint at shifting loyalty was to risk being crushed by both sides. To choose wrongly was to court ruin. And in the eyes of both men, hesitation could be as damning as open betrayal. By the end of that year, Salvidienus's name had faded from the daily conversations of Rome. His fate was sealed not only by the dagger he had used to end his life, but by the deliberate forgetting that followed. The Republic had moved on, as it always did, leaving behind the wreckage of another man who had misjudged the tides. But somewhere in Gaul, perhaps in the mind of an old legionary who had once marched under him, or in the private recollections of a senator who had known him in better days, the memory lingered, not as a moral lesson, but as a reminder of how quickly the climb could turn into the fall. History rarely pauses for the fallen. The death of Quintus Salvius Salvidienus Rufus was not a turning point in the story of the Republic. It was a footnote, quickly subsumed by the larger forces grinding toward the inevitable confrontation between Octavian and Antony. Yet within that footnote lies a truth that cuts to the heart of Roman politics, and to the nature of ambition itself. Salvidienus had risen further than the world of his birth had any right to offer him. In an age when lineage still defined the boundaries of possibility, he had crossed those boundaries through skill, loyalty, and a talent for navigating the currents of power. From the obscurity of an unremarkable family, he had climbed into the consulship, governed one of Rome's most vital provinces, and commanded legions whose loyalty could shift the balance of empires. In the ledger of achievement, his early career was a testament to what Rome claimed to be, a place where ability could, at least in times of chaos, overcome the weight of tradition. But Rome was never simply a meritocracy. The same system that rewarded ability demanded an unflinching awareness of where that ability was applied and whose cause it served. To misunderstand that balance was to court disaster. Salvidinus's tragedy was not merely that he betrayed Octavian. It was that he miscalculated the cost and timing of that betrayal. In the late Republic, loyalty was a currency, but like all currencies, its value depended on the stability of the state that minted it. And in 39 BC, the value of loyalty to Octavian was climbing rapidly. The lesson was not lost on the men who watched him fall. Other governors and commanders, some perhaps already weighing their own options, would have seen in Salvidienus fate the outline of a warning that to shift allegiance was to gamble everything, and that Octavian's reach extended far enough to make the game a short one. The Hostis Publicus decree was not just a legal sentence. It was a message sent to every frontier of the Republic, carried in the silence that followed. The general in Gaul had been erased, and the erasure itself became the point. Octavian's handling of the affair revealed the qualities that would one day make him Augustus. He acted with speed, but without rashness, ensuring that the Senate's judgment wrapped his personal decision in the legitimacy of law. He did not allow the matter to become a public spectacle, denying Antony the chance to use it as a rallying cry. And most importantly, he absorbed the betrayal into the larger narrative of his own political survival. Proof, as he would frame it, that Antony's influence threatened the unity of Rome. Antony, for his part, treated the loss as inconsequential. Whether he had ever truly intended to secure Salvidienus as an ally is unknown. Perhaps the overture had come too late, when the gap between East and West had already hardened into an impassable divide. Perhaps Antony, calculating as Octavian was, saw more value in letting his rival deal with the problem than in intervening. In any case, his silence spoke volumes. In the high game they were playing, Salvidienus was not a king or even a knight. He was a piece to be sacrificed without regret. And yet, for all the cold efficiency with which the principals disposed of him, the story of Salvidienus is not simply one of failure. It is also one of the dangerous proximity between success and ruin in the Roman world. To be entrusted with great power was to be placed within arm's reach of those who could take it away. To serve men like Octavian and Antony was to live under the constant pressure of their ambitions, to thrive in their favor one day, and to be destroyed by their suspicion the next. That proximity, perhaps more than the betrayal itself, is what gives the story its enduring resonance. Salvidienus did not fall because he lacked ability. He fell because in Rome, ability was never enough. The Republic was a web of shifting allegiances, where yesterday's loyalty could become tomorrow's liability, and where the ultimate prize, survival, belonged to those who could read the wind before it changed. After his death, there was no rehabilitation of his name. The chroniclers of the Augustan age, whether through loyalty, fear, or self-interest, wrote of him only in the context of treachery. His earlier service was acknowledged only insofar as it made his betrayal more damning. In the public memory, he became an example, not of Rome's opportunities, but of its dangers. His rise was forgotten, his fall became his legacy. And yet, somewhere beneath the layers of condemnation and erasure, the human story remains. The man who weighed his options through a cold winter in Gaul, who measured the strengths of two masters and believed he could choose between them, was not unique in his ambition. He was, in many ways, entirely Roman, shaped by a culture that celebrated the audacity to climb and punished without mercy those who misstepped. His error was believing that he could time his move without being caught between the two great forces of his age. The Republic itself was nearing its own end. Within a few short years, the alliance between Octavian and Antony would collapse entirely, plunging Rome into the final and most decisive of its civil wars. At Actium, Octavian would emerge as the sole master of the Roman world. Antony dead, Cleopatra gone, the Senate reduced to a rubber stamp. In that new order, there would be no room for men like Salvidienus, men whose loyalties could shift with the political weather. Augustus, as Octavian would now be called, would build his empire on a different kind of loyalty, not the personal allegiance of equals, but the obedience of subordinates who knew there was no other game to play. Looking back, it is easy to see Salvidienus's fate as inevitable. But inevitability is the lie history tells about events that have already happened. In the moment, the choice must have felt alive with possibility. The belief that by aligning with Antony, he could secure a place in whatever Rome emerged from the next war. That belief was wrong, but it was not foolish by the standards of his time. Others made similar gambles and survived. He simply made his too soon, or too openly, or with too little protection. And so the question lingers, the question that gives his story its edge even now. In a world where survival depends on choosing the winning side, what would you have done? Would you have stayed loyal to Octavian, trusting that his rise would carry you with it? Or would you have reached toward Antony, betting on his wealth and armies to decide the fate of Rome? Would you have risked everything for the possibility of standing on the winning side? Or risked nothing and lived to see the world ruled without you? Rome never stopped asking that question of its servants. And for Salvidienus, as for so many before and after him, the answer was written not in victories or titles, but in the silence that follows when the game ends and the board is cleared. His legacy is not in marble or bronze, not in the provinces he governed or the battles he fought, but in the reminder that in the Republic's final years the climb and the fall were separated by a distance no greater than a single letter carried across the sea.